In this lecture, we're going to talk about some of the things that make up understanding. That is, how do humans understand things, and what attributes of our understanding do machines and AI systems still lack? So an important one is this collection of things that is referred to as core knowledge. So Mitchell talks about how we have intuitive knowledge of the world that is based on, basically our experience, even from our earliest days, even from when we're still babies and we can hardly do anything. So we gradually acquire this knowledge about physics, about how objects behave, about gravity, about how things roll, about how things stop. We acquire intuitive knowledge about biology, about living things, about ants, about birds, about ourselves, about other people, about pain and how you walk, how you sit down, what hurts and what feels good. We also gain intuitive knowledge about psychology so that we can predict how other people might react to something we say or something we do, and we can empathize with them. So this knowledge, this collection of core knowledge or intuitive knowledge, is a big part of our cognitive development, and it might be what's required to allow humans to learn in the first place. Now, mental models are something we all build without even thinking about it. And it's kind of funny because it happens in our minds, but it's sort of automatic. So as you learn about the world and as you come to know things from, your earliest days on through the present, you build these mental models and they help you understand what to expect. It's sort of like an if-then sort of scenario in your mind, only you don't have to run through it consciously. It's just there because it has evolved in your mind over time. One thing about mental models is it means you're not surprised when everyday common things happen, right? So if you insult somebody, they get angry. And that doesn't surprise you, right? Because you have a mental model of what happens when a person, either you or someone else, hears an insult from somebody else. Now, these mental models are kind of like a built-in prediction machine, right? And we can imagine in advance. Now, this would be deliberate. We can sit down and imagine, well, what will happen if I do this with my mom, with my husband, with some person, with your teacher. You can walk through different scenarios, and this is also possible because of your mental models. Mitchell asks us if simulation is actually the basis of how we understand. So simulation is a little bit different from a mental model. A simulation is maybe even more imaginative. Like you can imagine a place you've never been when you're planning to go there, and you can sort of put yourself in that place, or a kind of scenario that you've never been in before, right? You can kind of think about consequences and actions and how you'll feel when you're there and how you'll be. And if you couldn't simulate the future, if you couldn't imagine the future before it happens, probably you would just be acting automatically. So simulation is the way that we create the future in our minds. Whenever you consume some kind of fictional material, or even a documentary or a news report, you're also kind of simulating the factors that went into that, the things that are off screen, the things you didn't see, the reason that characters in a movie behave the way they behave. We even simulate abstract concepts like love, like loyalty. We can understand these abstractions through our simulations of something concrete, like how people behave when they're feeling that way, or when they're doing that thing, or they're expressing their loyalty or their bravery. You don't really have a concept of bravery without a simulation in your mind of what does it look like to be brave? When have I seen a person being brave? Possibly just in, a TV show or something. Now, another way that humans understand things is through metaphor. And you may have learned about metaphor mainly as something that people use in writing, that authors use when they write books and so forth. And it is a figure of speech. That's one way to look at it. That when you use one word or phrase in a way to represent something that it isn't really. So I like the example I've got here, drowning in money. That rich guy is drowning in money, right? Or he's swimming in cash, right? So that's an example of a metaphor. And this way of imagining things in a metaphorical sense is also part of the way that we understand abstract concepts. And Mitchell gives some really good examples of these, in my opinion, when she talks about time, which is an abstract concept. And she says, well, we talk about saving time and spending time. So those are metaphors. And she talks about our emotions. You say you're up or you're down. I'm feeling really up today. I'm on a high right now. Not meaning, high, but like I'm really happy, so I'm flying high, right? So we use these kind of metaphors sometimes in speaking, but we also use them in thinking. Back at the beginning of the class, I told you we weren't going to get deep into the weeds with the idea of consciousness. What is it? What isn't it? Who has it? Who doesn't? Consciousness is discussed at great length in many books and essays by philosophers and also by neuroscientists. And of course, those two groups of people discuss it differently, but sometimes their discussions overlap and their descriptions. So neither philosophers nor neuroscientists can tell us definitively what consciousness is, where it comes from, how it gets made. So consciousness is a question, but it will come up sometimes when we talk about AIs and computers and, machine learning, and is it actually learning if it doesn't understand? And what does it mean to understand? Do you have to have consciousness or self-awareness in order to understand? And one way of looking at this too is to ask yourself, do you believe that animals like cats and dogs have consciousness? Maybe you do. Do you believe that plants have consciousness? And when do people become conscious? Are you conscious before you're born? Are you conscious from the moment of your birth? Or does consciousness come to us later? And if so, when and under what conditions? And these are all questions that have not been answered. So if you're curious about this idea, the concept of consciousness, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to kind of get your feet wet and start exploring, what philosophers have written about consciousness over actually centuries, right? Because when you're talking about the human mind and self-awareness and how humans think, consciousness is always coming up. But in this course, we've avoided talking about whether machines would ever have consciousness, and I'm going to continue avoiding that. But Mitchell goes so far to talk about, in this idea of being aware of yourself. Coming along with that is not just that you can look down at your hands and know that these are my hands, but it's also this ability we have to simulate and to construct mental models of our world so that we can predict, we can expect, we know things that are going to happen because we know how things work in the world. And along with this is the idea that you can even create a mental model of your own mind and of the mental models in your mind and the simulations. So I like this quote because then she says, I have a model of my own model. And this is a thing that we are pretty sure it's not going to be possible to have AI systems that do this for a very long time. Something else that is part of our ability to understand is abstraction, our ability to think abstractly. So at the basis of this idea, right, is that some things are abstract and some things are concrete. And there's only two categories here, concrete, abstract. There's no in between. So abstract things include things that we really take for granted and we can think about easily, like numbers, categories, concepts, the letter A in the alphabet, and a book that you may have read or heard of or maybe not, Dante's Inferno. So these are abstract concepts in your mind. Now, concrete things are the stars. Even though you can't touch them, they're real, they're concrete. Electromagnetic fields. You can't touch them, but they're concrete. The chalk lines on a blackboard that make up the letter A. So the letter A is an abstract concept, but the actual letter A written on a piece of paper or on a blackboard, that is concrete. The actual copy of the book, Dante's Inferno, is concrete, whereas the idea of the book is quite abstract. So I took these examples from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so I did not make these up. So abstraction is the basis of concepts that we can hold in our minds, right? So concepts about things like number, time, love. The ability to think abstractly enables us to create categories or use categories that have already been created and place things in categories and recognize how things should be sorted based on different attributes and features that they have. Our ability to abstract or our ability for abstraction allows us to recognize somebody who we haven't seen even for years and they've changed a lot, their hair is different, perhaps if it's a man he's grown a beard, but you recognize him and you know he's the same person. That's abstraction. Another example of an abstraction is our ability to generalize. And we've talked about this when we talked about image recognition, right? We know that a dog is a dog, even if it's some mixed breed mutt that doesn't look like any dog we ever saw before. We immediately know that's a dog because we have a concept of a dog. And underlying that is our ability to abstract from all dogs to one specific dog that we just met for the first time. Now, analogy is another thing that comes up in writing classes, and you might have had a writing teacher who talked to you about using metaphors and analogies in your writing. But analogies are also used in our minds in everyday, just, without us deliberately using them, we make certain kinds of comparisons, and these comparisons enable us to understand. So if somebody early in the pandemic told you that the current pandemic is a lot like the Spanish flu of 1918, you might have never heard of the Spanish flu at that time, but you could have looked that up and maybe become very worried about the current pandemic. Because you would be able to make analogies in your mind while you were reading about the Spanish flu. And you'd say, wow, is that what's going to happen to us? Another example of an analogy is that guy's style of debating makes me think of the way that Muhammad Ali boxed. Now, maybe you haven't seen a debater who could bob and weave and dance and, sting like a butterfly and sting like a bee and float like a butterfly. But some debaters can do that. So I could make that analogy, right? And if you knew Muhammad Ali and you knew what debate was, you would instantly understand what I was trying to say. Something that's very down to earth is if I came out of somebody's dorm and I said her dorm room looks like a town after a tornado hit it. You have seen pictures of a town after a tornado hit, and you would know what I was trying to say about her room. You would have a mental image because of that analogy. So when we read or hear an analogy, it allows us to make inferences very quickly about the thing that we haven't seen or that we don't know, because we understand the other thing to which the analogy was made. So now that we've talked about these components of understanding, right? What is it to understand? What does it mean when we say we are able to understand things? With what you know about AI systems and how they learn, how they play games, how they process and recognize images, and how they figure out what was asked by a human, and how they figure out how to respond. You have this idea now of how the machine actually works, how the programming works, how the system is doing these things that we call artificial intelligence. Do you think that any of these things that the machines do include any of the things on this list that you see on the left side? Do machines understand? And another question is, will we ever get to a point where programming and software is able to produce a system that does do these things the way that we do them, does them really, and that might lead to a machine having understanding or being able to understand?